Welcome back to Cheddar Business. About 100 protesters remain on a Hong Kong university campus after hundreds were evacuated from the lockdown. The unrest continuing on the streets after months of demonstrations. And joining us now is Olivia Enos, policy analyst at the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. Olivia, what turning point is this in the protests?
This is a significant turning point, particularly since Hong Kong protests writ large have tended to be more peaceful. Of course, we've seen immense violence, with many news organizations reporting that this is the most violence that we've seen since the protests began more than 5 months ago. And so we're looking here at an uptick in violence, and correlating with this really awful standoff at the Hong Kong's Polytechnic University is also some moves that are happening in Hong Kong's court. Earlier in the year, there was the institution of a ban on all masks for protesters. A Hong Kong court has now ruled that that is unconstitutional, that it does not comport with Hong Kong's basic law. But now Beijing is saying that Hong Kong's court does not have the right to make determinations like this. And so this may be the straw that breaks the camel's back, where we really see Beijing intervening in a meaningful way in Hong Kong's rule of law. And just as a helpful reminder, Hong Kong protesters took to the street initially because of the potential institution of an extradition bill that would have violated and undermined rule of law in Hong Kong. If Beijing makes an attempt to intervene in what has largely been a free and fair judiciary in Hong Kong, we could see very, very severe intervention on the horizon, where Beijing is starting to really step into the average lives of Hong Kong citizens.
Yeah, can you break that down a little bit more? What does a Beijing intervention actually look like in Hong Kong?
So, of course, early on in protests, there were concerns that there would be some form of military intervention by Beijing. Of course, we haven't seen that up until now, although we have definitely seen Chinese security forces take to the streets to sort of quell protests in Hong Kong, but we have not seen any sort of major military intervention. I think some of the more pernicious forms of intervention, however, happen when Hong Kong's judiciary no longer enjoys independence, and you don't see Hong Kongers being able to preserve rule of law, being able to preserve economic freedom. I think what needs to be at the root of these protests, and what the U.S. needs to continue to support, are the peaceful elements of the protests that would stand for long-term health and preservation of rule of law in Hong Kong, one that upholds the basic law, which
Olivia,
has established the framework there.
Do you anticipate under President Trump that will be something that the U.S. supports as these protests continue?
Well, the U.S. needs to continue to support the peaceful elements of the protests. We've seen positive statements from Secretary Pompeo and, of course, a lot of activity on Capitol Hill in support of Hong Kong protesters. But, of course, it is up to the president at the end of the day to make clear, unequivocal statements where there's condemnations of violence, both when the Hong Kong security forces are carrying out police brutality, but also when protesters are engaging in violent activities, and continue to encourage those peaceful elements of the protests that really seek to advance freedom and liberty in Hong Kong.
It was interesting. Earlier this week, Olivia, we learned that for the first time, right, since the financial crisis this year, Hong Kong is expected to see a recession. We've had guests on the show that have said tourism is down 50% since the protests began. What is the economic impact for Hong Kong as these protests continue on? And does it get to a point where it's just too much that encourages the protesters to perhaps stop?
Yeah, I mean, Hong Kong has been a bastion of economic freedom. They've ranked #1 in the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom since the inaugural report more than 20 years ago. And so economic freedom is something that average Hong Kongers hold really dear. I hope that that will continue to be a driver if those protest movements do continue. But I really do think that protesters need to eschew violence And I think that the protesters are right to demand, some sort of investigation by the government into police brutality that has taken place since the protests began. I think it's very important that Hong Kong preserve economic freedom. I think that's why the U.S. needs to continue to encourage peaceful protesting so that businesses can continue to flourish and operate, and so that Hong Kong's economy is not harmed over the long term due to ongoing instability.
Yeah, Olivia, given all these pressures, just to sum it up, how close do you think we are to an end to these protests?
I think that's been the million-dollar question since these protests first began, and I think it's a very difficult one to answer. The protesters have been stalwart in sticking to their 5 initial demands, which include universal suffrage. They include that, investigation into police brutality, among other claims. And of course, they did have one of their demands met, that the extradition bill, which was initially proposed and would have posed existential threat to liberty in Hong Kong, has been revoked. But they continue to stick to those protests and those initial demands. I think it may be time for protesters to really revisit those and to make sure that they don't overplay their hand, because they have enjoyed large and broad support, rightfully so, from the international community. But if there's a drastic turn toward violence, they risk losing that support.
All right. Olivia Enos, policy analyst at the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks for joining us, Olivia.
Thank you so much for having me, Nora and Kristen.
We do have some